Welcome to our program, Portsmouth Remembers, as we celebrate the first anniversary of the African reburial ceremonies held on May 23, 2015. My name is JerriAnne Boggis, and I'm the director of the Portsmouth Black Heritage Trail. And with me in our studio today is a group of committed citizens who have worked real hard to bring the story of the African Burying Ground to light. They will share their memories of the day the space was returned to sacred ground, and also the transformative efforts their involvement with the project brought. We will open the program with our first guest, Valerie Cunningham, who needs no introduction in Portsmouth, is as the founder of the Portsmouth Black Heritage Trail and the author of Black Portsmouth, and also Kathleen Wheeler, owner and director of Independent Archaeology Consultants. Welcome, ladies, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
Many in our community really just learned about the African Burying Ground in 2013, when 13 coffins were unearthed on Chestnut Street. However, Valerie, you knew about the existence of these, the importance of this ground long before then. Can you share with us how you got involved with this project?
Yeah, the coffins were exposed in the year 2003, and so I want to tell you what I knew about that site prior to that. I had the great fortune of growing up in this neighborhood at a time before Portsmouth became gentrified. I mean, this neighborhood right where we are sitting. We kids actually played together in the streets at that time, and we played in Prescott Park before there were all those pretty flowers. Gardner Street was the greatest hill for sledding in the winter. But of course there's much more to that story. As I heard somebody say once, Portsmouth never was just like it used to be. De facto segregation in public places and restrictive covenants kept black people out of certain places during that time. This is where I'm talking about the 50s and 60s. I graduated from Portsmouth High School in the class of 1959, the same year that my parents helped to charter the Seacoast branch of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. And I read Brewster's Rambles About Portsmouth that was written in 1853. I was working at the Portsmouth Library at that time with Dorothy Bond, who many of you have either knew or heard of. And so I was very much aware of the history of the area and what was happening to save the place from urban renewal and so forth. But I was also very much aware of the civil rights movement, which was happening right here in Portsmouth. It was Rambles About Portsmouth, though, that led me to do more research on the colonial era of black Yankees, and ultimately led me to helping to establish the Portsmouth Black Heritage Trail. So the Black Heritage Trail was established in 1995 with 24 historic sites, including the Langdon Slave Cemetery on Lafayette Road and the so-called Negro Burying Ground on Chestnut Street in Portsmouth. By this time, I had heard old folks talking, and I had found written documentation in town records and local newspapers referring to the paved-over graveyard downtown For instance, it was written in the Portsmouth Daily Chronicle in 1858. The Portsmouth Daily Chronicle was one of our daily papers at that time. In 1858, that human bones were being tossed around Chestnut Street as workmen were installing gas lines there. One complete skeleton was seen in a coffin described as a large, tall man. So, as I said, there was other documentation that made us know that this was, in fact, the Negro burying ground, as it was called. Mark Sammons and I described what we knew about the burying ground in the area between Court and State Streets to the west of Chestnut Street in our first book in 1996. And again, in the final manuscript of our second book, which was submitted to the editor just 4 days before the graves were exposed in 2003.
So the story of the African burying ground was in the 1996 manuscript, and
Yes,
also
it was.
in the book that you and Mark published later on,
Yes.
The Black Portsmouth.
And because and we even added an afterword, because we had already sent the manuscript to the editor just days before the graves were exposed in 2003, and the editor allowed us time to put an afterword in the back, which sort of acknowledges that.
So both your manuscripts and the article in the newspaper, which we do have a picture of it, also shows us that the ground, 2003 was not the first time the ground had been disturbed.
Right.
So the burying ground was part of Portsmouth history. Kathy, just take a look at this image for me. It's the corner of Chestnut and Court Street. I'm sure, like the rest of us, I'm not sure how you felt about this, but it looked like a very typical New England street until you got involved, right? Is that what you saw?
Portsmouth is a fantastic, beautiful, historical city, and it's been a long time. It took me a long time to realize how much black effort went into building this city. So when I would look at this landscape at first, I never saw the black people who were enslaved and who worked and who lived in the garrets. And if you go to a lot of these historic houses, they talk rather, not very respectfully of the black people that lived in the garrets. But when I got involved in this project, we started as historians, as archaeologists, as scientists. We looked at the records, we looked back at the newspapers, we looked back at the maps. And there was really good evidence that there was, in fact, the Negro burying ground right here at that intersection of Court and Chestnut Street. The project in 2003 ostensibly was to remain largely in Court Street, but there was this little stub that went up into Chestnut Street. And it was a stub for a new manhole, and it was in the excavation of a manhole that needed to be 6 feet deep that we encountered the very first coffin.
And you got a call?
Yes, there was a field engineer who was monitoring all activities, and he had been forewarned that this area was very sensitive. Anything came up untoward, they were to contact me and Valerie. And I got a call October 6th, a little 8:06 a.m., and he said, "There's something out here." And I said, "Okay," and I ran right out, and there in fact was, at the bottom of a hole, a 6-sided coffin base with human bone on it. And I knew at that moment we had just turned a monumental corner in the history of Portsmouth.
Okay. There's a picture up on the screen of the excavation, I think.
Yes.
And where were you?
I'm in the orange. I'm kneeling inside that hole.
So you're in?
I'm the first one in.
You were the first one in. So can you recall what you were feeling?
There was a horrible weight of responsibility that I had to get this right. And that was a sentiment that I carried throughout this project, that it fell on my shoulders now to make sure that whatever happened to those remains and those people had to be done in the correct and most respectful manner.
One of the most painful images that I saw actually from the excavation was a clay pipe going through through some of the coffins that were unearthed. Could you tell me how you felt at the moment when you saw that? Because you were right in there.
I use this image often when I talk and tell other people this story. And I do need to remind people this is a created image that only archaeologists would see, because initially this clay pipe was excavated in a small, narrow trench, probably no larger than the shoulder width of the man or the workman that was digging that hole. We opened up a much broader area so you could actually start to see the full effect of how one trench for a sewer line really just desecrated a whole row of graves. And it was horrifying to see it.
And that horror led you to a whole new way of looking at these burials. One of the real transformative moment, I think, in our ceremony for the reburial was when you stood, when the caskets were getting ready to be moved on the caisson, and you started talking about them. Can you share with us that moment? Can you share with the audience that moment as we look at this image?
There's a whole thread. I mean, this started in 2003, and finally in 2015, everybody got relayed to rest. And 2 days before the reburial, I was privileged enough to attend the repositioning of bone into the new caskets. And that was a job that was preserved for the female elders. And in that moment, in those moments with those women, there was a great intimacy, and people got to see and touch those bones and understand a little bit about those people that have been buried. So on the morning when I was meeting with the pallbearers, I realized, and it just came intuitively, this was a moment that these men were participating in, and they didn't know much about these individuals. So as we loaded them individually on the caisson, I went back and I basically said goodbye to each of them. The women, the female elders, were very much taken with the child. There was one child recovered among them. We don't know if it was a male or female child. The child had died between 7 and 12 years old. And the child's coffin was buried or laid on top of a second coffin that was an older male. And there was a dancer. There was a very tall man that I just had a very clear sense was a dancer. There was a woman that was buried a little bit separately from everybody else and backwards from everybody else. And I had a clear sense that she was an uppity black female that the white community probably insisted had her own separation from the group. Yet I saw her as the leader. I saw her out on the edge. And I wanted the pallbearers to know something about those folks. So I went back and just said goodbye to the dancer, goodbye to the uppity woman, goodbye to the child, goodbye to the male who rested with the child. There was another woman who had a painful abscess on her leg. We can see that in the bone. And I wondered what kind of travels and labors and work that she did that and left those kind of, that horrible mark on her bones. And in that moment, I just wanted to try to bring those people alive.
And you did indeed, because if we look at the faces of the men at that time that when you spoke of these remains, spoke of the bodies of our ancestors, it really transformed that moment. And I know this event was very transformative for both of you. We're actually coming to the end of this section. I know we'll have to do a whole other program in order to really bring the souls of our ancestors to life. And I do appreciate it. Thank you both for being here, for the work you've done, and for sharing your stories with us. In a moment, we'll be coming back to talk with the very women and pallbearers that you spoke of. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Welcome back to our second segment, in which we will speak to members of our community that participated in a special ritual that honored the remains of our ancestors in a very special way. And with me today, sharing that special, sharing their memories of that special moment, are Jill Minot from Seabrook and Carmen Buford Page from Dover, Peter Lamb from Kittery Point, and Keith Mascot from Boston, who served as one of 19 pallbearers. Ladies, one of the special ways that we honor the remains of our ancestors on that for reburial was to gather the elder women in our communities to prepare the remains for burial in a very special way. Could you talk a little bit about how you felt when you were participating in this part of the ritual?
Well, for me, I thought it had come full circle. In the late 1990s, I had had an opportunity to take a trip to Africa, and I visited Côte d'Ivoire, Senegal, and the island of Gorée. So for me, it was very emotional. One of the things that you did ask us to bring were artifacts that we thought we wanted to have laid in the coffin along with the bodies. And I had brought a couple of things that I had purchased when I was at Gorée Island, and thought that this was almost full circle, because this is where we know that most of the slaves had shipped out into the Americas. It was very emotional to me. I was very angry, and sometimes it's very difficult to realize that human beings were treated in such a way. Having had the opportunity to see where they were held on the island of Gorée in a 12 by 10 room with 200 people in it, aged, placed by age. And I often thought as a kid, learning a little bit about Black history that I was taught, which was always about slavery and nothing else, was that why in the heck didn't they fight back? Why didn't they jump? Why didn't they run away? But when I saw the room when it said for infants or for women, and knowing there were 200 people, no bathrooms, nothing there was a window that was about 12 inches long and 4 inches wide. And when you looked out that window, all you saw was the ocean. And so suddenly it dawned on me, they had no choice. The other part that made me very angry was that the people who were in charge of them, watching over them before they were shipped out, lived above them. And all I could envision was the moaning, the groaning, the feeling of loss of family and children, and wondering what's going to happen to them, but most importantly, what's going to happen to their families, and not knowing the unknown in terms of what was going to take place.
Did the preparation of the bones bring any kind of reconciliation, any kind of, like you said, it came full circle, but were you still angry, or was there that tenderness? There were some pictures we have that shown, especially you, when you were fixing the lining of the coffins, the cloth, with this really tenderness. I think we'll show an image of that. But there was such tenderness when you were folding the fabrics, preparing the remains. Did it offer any solace at all?
It offered a sense of peace that they were finally being recognized, that somebody cared and was able to readdress their lives and also their final moments. I think that was really very important, that they were not forgotten, not only not forgotten by their families, but by their ancestors who remember.
Thank you so much. And Carmen, I remember you walking around the room looking at each of the coffins, every single one of them, really for a moment before you started working on them, before you engaged in wrapping, the very gently these bits of what were once human. Could you tell me what you were feeling when you were walking the room?
Oh, I was feeling a lot of sorrow, but even more anger. As someone who taught African American history in California, and I was chair of a department, I have learned a lot about African American history. But to be faced with the stark cruelty was something different. I was raised in a 4-generation household, and I remember my great-grandmother, who was raised in the big house in Mississippi. She was the daughter of the slave master and an Indian slave. And she told me about some of the some of the things that happened to enslaved Africans on the plantation. And I know the original African ancestor on my mother's side who arrived on the Middle Passage. And all of that just came over me, you know. And then my daughter was able to give me an artifact to put in one of the coffins. She went to Nigeria with the Justice Department, and she brought back several things, and she gave me one to put in there. And it was like, well, at least you have a piece of home. I didn't see them as making full circle, but I did see them as at least having a little piece of home.
Thank you so much. Peter, there is you have a particular story that you want to share with us. I'm just going to pull up an image of one of the caskets. The archaeologists had a particular problem when they were trying to figure out just how to honor the remains, because usually with burials you have a full human, and what we had left were just bits of what was left, bones. And they wanted to really dignify the remains in as much, in all ways possible. And they were worried about securing these remains in the caskets. And you came up with a great idea. Could you just tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. I was trying to find some way that I might help with this, this whole ceremony, and I had some pieces of wood from rock rest. During a recent renovation, I had gotten some pieces of the timber frame building these were hand-hewn timbers from trees that were alive when the people in the burying ground were also alive. And I had some pieces, and I thought that I could make shavings from these timbers, hand-planed shavings. And so I asked, and 6 bushels of shavings were needed. And I thought shavings from rock rest, shavings like this, that would be very light pieces of wood that came from a place that actually has a lot of joy in that building, and trees that were alive at the same time that these people were alive. So I, in my workshop, took a hand plane and spent many days making shavings, over 10,000 shavings altogether like this. My own family are old-time English-descended early settlers of this region and New England from the very first days. And I am sure that many members of my family who were ship owners and shipbuilders and craftsmen and financiers likely had enslaved people in their household. I don't know that for a fact, but I can't believe that they didn't. And so for me, working in silence, just with the sound of the wooden plane, making these shavings, thousands and thousands of shavings, it gave me a lot of meaning, and I was particularly honored to stand for those who suffered in the Middle Passage, because I felt like I was trying to make some connection, some reconciliation in my own mind about how this was even possible that this had happened. So I felt like it was a full cycle of bringing some life to cushion those remains in the caskets.
Thank you so much. I must mention to those of you watching that Rock Rest is a early African American guest house during the time of de facto segregation, where the blacks were not allowed to stay in hotels, and there was this black-owned guest house in Maine rock rest that you spoke of. So there was also that connection too, you know, of contemporary African souls to souls of our ancestors that passed on. So that was really very special for us. And I think everybody got a bit of the wood to take home as a part of that ritual. So thank you much, Peter. So Keith, you served as a pallbearer, and you're from Boston.
Yes.
Can you tell us why it was important for you to participate in this event as a member of the larger African American community?
For me, first, let me just say it was an honor for me to be a pallbearer. Very emotional, but it was important for me to be part of the healing. You know, there's not many places in the U.S. that has acknowledged things that they're not proud of. You know, but Portsmouth is one of the only, if not the only city that has decided to do something about it and be respectful about it and do the right thing. And I think that's important. There's a lot of rich history in Boston, but there's a lot of rich history too, and it was important for me to be a part of it. I've done some work with Barbara Ward of the Moffat Ladd House as an actor, and so that's what led me to be part of this process. And very rarely does your art lead you to be involved in such a powerful event. And so it was an honor for me to be here. But this is not just Portsmouth's history. It's everyone's history. It's, you know, African Americans need to know about this story of what happened, but also to acknowledge what was done about it. I've done so much to spread the word, and I've had people on Facebook come and show me the pictures, because now people from Boston are coming to Portsmouth to see what was done, to see the burial ground, and they're telling other people, and that's amazing to spread that seed.
So there's a connection between our communities here and the broader African American communities outside of Portsmouth, because it tells a collective story.
Exactly.
That's what you were saying.
Exactly. It tells a collective story, and also it's part of my history, my ancestors as well. I was so moved by being a pallbearer that there was a piece of tape that was underneath my coffin, and I still have it. I kept it. I put it on my phone, and even though my phone is broken, I still have it, and I still carry it with me and tell the story of why I have it. Because people always ask me, why do you have a piece of tape? I'm like, no, this is not just a piece of tape. And so I tell them the story of how I got to be involved and about the process, and people are pretty blown away by it and want to come to Portsmouth to see everything.
Okay. Let's just take a look at some of the images from the reburial. So here we have a picture of the men, some of the pallbearers, along with Oscar, our chief officiator of the program, and as they leave. And to me, it's such a poignant picture. What kind of emotions were brought up for you as you carried these remains?
Oh man, definitely a sense of responsibility, of course. I was definitely I was very sad in the moment, but also just ecstatic that I was able to help lay them to rest. It was just, you know, and it's almost undescribable, because I felt so many different emotions at that time, but I also was proud. It was a proud moment for me to be involved. Just amazing.
Are there any more thoughts anybody would like to share about, you know, that any transformative feelings from this event?
Well, one thing I would like to say is that there were slaves in every one of the contiguous states. We don't believe there were any in Alaska or in Hawaii, but in the 48 contiguous states there were slaves. And I would like to see some kind of monument in each state, something to recognize the contributions of African slaves and their descendants to that state.
Well, thank you all so much. Portsmouth is a little bit ahead of the game that we have our memorial part now. So, your contributions to this ceremonies is just invaluable. And I know we have returned a group of people, Portsmouth's African community, back to our collective memory with your help. Thank you so much. It is said that the ritual of burials, funerals, serve as a way to connect us not only to our deceased, but to something higher than ourselves, the spiritual part of our being as humans. And with me now are guests, Reverend Bill Humphrey and Reverend Lauren Smith, to talk a little bit about the spiritual significance of these reburials, what it meant to us as a community, and what it means, and if it has any possibilities of offering healing in our communities. To get us started, I just wanted to take a look at some of the emotions that we saw on the faces of the people who participated in this event. So let's look at some of the other emotions that were brought up during this event. We have, grief. We had the tears, someone just, breaking out in grief, in tears. Then we had Reverend Jeff. He looks here almost ecstatic, worshiping in that singing, that reverence, the moment of reverence. Then in this picture of a group of people, we have someone clutching their heart. We have somebody, their hands held in prayer, almost, pain, kind of recollecting the horror of the moment, and a very contemplative image. The next picture shows Reverend Hilson, and I labeled this, I'm not sure if that's what he was feeling, but I labeled it as resignation. Maybe anger, but definitely resignation. And finally, Royaline Edwards. This is a picture of pure ecstasy, just the joy in the moment, a kind of a completion of a cycle, as we talked about earlier. Could you kind of bring us to an understanding or talk about why so many emotions at such a time?
I think these emotions are all a part of who we are. I don't think there is one emotion that embraces or has more significance than the others. As an African American, I think anger is part of what we have grown to know. It's not unusual. On the other hand, resignation, I look at, isn't really resignation, but I see hope. As a person, as a Southerner, burials have a different flavor for us. We don't call them burials. And some of my colleagues out there will know that we call them homecomings. Homecomings are joyous occasions. I mean, funerals tend to be down, but burials are down, but homecomings, that's a welcome, because it is part of who we are. There is no eternity for us as this body.
I think that we have an intuitive understanding that each life is sacred, and we encounter that really vividly at various times. I think this was a moment in which many of us touched down into the sort of the holiness of each of these lives and the reality of what each of these people encountered in life, which was so out of joint with how holy each of these lives was. And so to meet that just so vividly in a moment, everything comes up. The horror of it, the acknowledgement of it, And there is something profoundly healing about witness, about opening up that reality of the beauty of those lives, the horror of what they went through, opening it back up and touching down into it with an entirely different set of intentions, love, of witness, of care, so everything was there. Everything was there all at once. It makes sense to me that the moment was so full.
Yeah, yeah. I was a pallbearer, and I can tell you the honor was there. I felt honored to be able to participate in this real recognition of the people who were there. But I know there are others who will never have this. And that's the significance to me of the burying ground. It's a place where we can go and recognize those whom we know, but more importantly, those whom we also don't know, who were also introduced to the body.
Mm-hmm. I do remember that moment when all 19 pallbearers were standing around the circle. And I remember looking at the faces of those men, and there was something empowering about that moment that I saw when you know, that we could say that our men could do something for us. And I think that was a transformative moment for our community at that moment. And that's one image that will always stay with me, because so often the black men in our culture don't have those opportunities to feel empowered, you know, and I thought this was a moment of empowerment, and it was such a blessed moment. Do you think there are any other opportunities that this event, the spiritual part of this event, can offer our community for the healing? How can we use this moment, especially in our current times where we seem so racially divided once again?
I think it's an example and an invitation to courage. I think there's a deep wound in the heart of the body politic that is ancient. It's old. It's hundreds of years old. I think of you know, when you're building a house, if you build the foundation badly and then you build the house on top of it, and then you realize that the house is built on a poor foundation, you look at the house and you realize you have to take a bunch down to rebuild something that is sound and lovely. And that reckoning is painful. So it requires courage to look at a situation and make it right. And I think this that happened in Portsmouth is an inspiration, because it's an example of that courage, of going back and looking at something that went deeply awry in the founding of our community, and to sort of open it up and do the many, many layers of attention and love that happened over so many years to bring some measure of healing into this community. I think it's a profound example for our country as a whole, and it is deep spiritual work.
Yeah, I think Peter's introduction of the shavings brought to me a recognition for all of those persons who say, I don't know if my family was a part of this directly, but I will accept the fact that, yes, this happened, and it's embarrassing, it's humiliating, and I want to do my part to say to all of the people assembled here that forgiveness is possible, it's probable, it's hopeful.
I think, too, that we have sort of a national story of freedom and opportunity, and I cherish it, and I think a lot of us cherish it. But there's a way in which that story has been told in ways that kind of you either have to embrace the story and pretend that the past didn't exist, that the story can only be alive and real if we pretend that the past didn't exist and it still isn't sort of playing itself out in our social and political structures currently. And so what's inspiring to me about this project is it says we value those stories. They're part of our national story. And but we don't have to pretend that the past didn't exist in order to claim it. We can go back. We have the courage, and we have the wisdom, and we have the heart to go back and do the work we need to do so that we can reclaim our national stories in a way that embraces our whole community. You know, we have what it takes to make our communities what we hope they can be, and that's beautiful.
It sure is. It's not a pretty story, our past.
No.
It's not an easy story to talk about. And there's lots of pain on both sides.
Yes.
You know, and unless we can really look at that, as you say, unless we can rebuild that foundation, it doesn't, well, there's a word you use, a reckoning, that we have to come with. And I think that's a scary word for a lot of people, because what does reckoning mean? Our past is so ugly. If we look at that reckoning, you know, it would be an ugly reckoning.
Yes.
You know?
And we're afraid the house will
And
fall
we're
down
exactly.
entirely and be destroyed,
Yeah.
but it doesn't have to be.
Okay.
And this community came together to show that it did not have to be an act of destruction, but an act of rebuilding and renewal.
Rebuilding and renewal. And that's exactly what the monuments and the memorials and the remembering of these people's life seem to have done here in Portsmouth. And I'm so glad you brought that up, because it's not, again, a simple answer, but it's a hopeful answer.
Yes.
It's a place that where we can start.
Yes.
And thank you so much for sharing your stories with us and bringing that spiritual touch, because it's all spiritual in the end, isn't it?
Yes.
If for us to transcend all of this, we have to move to the spirit.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we look forward to our next session, where we'll be speaking with some members of Portsmouth community to see where we are now and where we go from here. Thank you so much. As you can imagine, a project of this size and this magnitude took a lot of extraordinary work from a lot of extraordinary people. And just for a moment, I'd like to just highlight a few of these very important souls who brought this project to its fruition. If we could just take a picture and bring them up, just like to honor the artist and sculptor Jerome Meadows from Savannah, Georgia. We see his work. Master craftsman Jeffrey Cooper. We are so pleased. And thank you, Martha Fuller Clark and City Councilor Chris Dwyer for their work in this project. And all of this was under the auspice of our next guest, who will talk to us about her own personal experience. Vernice Jackson, founder of the Seacoast African American Cultural Science and the chairwoman of the Portsmouth African Burying Ground. We also have with us in the studio at the moment David Moore, the assistant city manager, and Skymar, a well-known figure, personality around town. Welcome. For this segment, I just want to look at your role in returning this space, the African Burying Ground, to sacred, the African Burying Ground back to sacred ground, what it meant for you, how, if any, transformation happened over the 10 years it took to bring this project to its conclusion, at least this part of the project, and any special stories that you want to share with us about the space. Vernice, I know recently you were quoted in the Richmond paper, and you said that this has been an emotional journey for me, because when I first came here, I didn't think that anybody would ever think in terms of honoring Africans in this manner. Could you speak a little bit about how you see Portsmouth now that you've come to lead this group to bring this visual memory to us?
I'm in a very different place now, but almost the same place as I was in 2003. When I first came to Portsmouth, or to the New England area, there weren't many people of my race or culture here. Not a lot for me to dig my heels into. So I just sort of tried to blend right in and start doing things that I had been doing all my life in my other hometown. Fast forward to 2003 with the opening, or the rediscovery rather, of the African Burying Ground. I was shocked, as many were, that there was such a place. It became an emotional thing for me because I, like other people, had thought that no, there couldn't be anything like that here. But as the journey proceeded, people like me began to look into it, began to become involved in what has now become an honor of the people who were there, who are there. I have spent the last 13 years making sure that this project came to fruition, helping others see, helping others to see what the benefits were, what the emotional and other kinds of benefits were. This time, however, I can't believe that this has happened, and I can say that I have never ever seen a community come together and so forcefully made sure that a project was finished and done. And as I said on the day a year ago, just about a year ago, that it just brought tears of joy to me to see what the community did with this project.
Well, thank you so much, Bernice. And now, David, the project just received a preservation award from the state, and you accepted on behalf of the city, the award on behalf of the city. And in your acceptance speech, you mentioned that you were sorry it took us so long, the 10 years, to get to that project. And I've worked with you since the project started, and I've seen your own kind of personal growth. Do you think this project changed you in any way?
Most certainly. It's had a profound impact on me professionally and personally. And what I had said related to the amount of time that the project took to come to fruition was that the time itself was an asset for our community, and the understanding and the time took had benefits in that we spoke about the project more. We had more one-on-one conversations about why it mattered to people that this return to sacred ground take place. And I don't think we would have the amount of joy and the embrace and the identification with this project as a community if those conversations and that time to incubate the very powerful and emotional and complex ideas that this project represents. If we didn't have that time, it might not have the depth of belonging I feel like the site does now have in the community. And I don't have as far as the transformation that this project has offered me professionally and personally, I don't have the experience of knowing what it's like to be an African American in our country. And I don't have the experience of dedicated public servants of African descent who have served our community for decades and in this same community. And it's constantly caused me to contemplate what it would be like after all of that time as a person who grew up here or a person who adopted this as a hometown, what it would be like for the wider community to say that my people, the people who came before me, the people beneath the street mattered, and that they contributed much to Portsmouth, not because they were enslaved and they were brought here and they gave us the opportunity to learn more in depth about Portsmouth history, but because they built Portsmouth and their lives mattered and they contributed greatly. And I am a part of it. And seeing that as a public servant and the response by so many people to this project and the connection to it has been an enormous privilege.
And thank you so much, because we see that you have a tenderness towards the site when you speak of it, and that's so much appreciated. Thank you so much. And I know, Sky, that you have a very, very, very deep connection with the site, the African Burying Ground. Would you care to share that with us?
Yes, but I want to say thank you to the two of you. It's just remarkable that this has occurred, and your generous donation of your life to this project, Vernus, and your attention to detail. It's been a remarkable event. In the early 70s, my husband and I bought the building that is on the corner of State Street and Chestnut. And at the time, we were buying it because his business was located in the building, and it was an appropriate thing for us to do. It was just a building. The prior owner, in conversation with me, had told me that, well, you know, dear, this building was built upon an American Indian burying ground. And I remember thinking at the time, how does she know that? I mean, what, did they find artifacts? Where did that come from? But later, it's really curious that after Valerie's work was available, and I realized it was not an American Indian burying ground, but it's curious to me to think that in the 70s I was told it was an Indian burying ground. Was it more palatable to the buyer? Was it, you know, what part of that conversation got translated? Was the prior owner's knowledge just lost about the black community and she really thought it was an Indian burying ground? Doesn't matter now, does it? But over the years, as we came to know the building and you know, had to work with the building, we had a failure in one of the water lines, and a man from the city of Portsmouth came to help us with the connection in the street, and he said to me in a hushed tone, as we were talking about the neighborhood, he said, you know, I was here when we put this water line in the street, and when we dug through the street, we uncovered barrels of bones. Barrels of bones? What did you do with them? He said, well, out back there. Well, my question is, are they all back there? What happened to them? I think, in fact, now we think they're back in there, disturbed. But again, still at that time, I didn't know if they were American Indian bones, or I hadn't read Valerie's work yet. So when this all started, it was very exciting to me and to my husband that we were actually knowing a little bit more about what was there. Our building was probably the first one to be built on that site. part of it was built in 1805. So that's an early piece. And for that whole block.
I'm getting the signal for us to wrap up now. But what your story brings to mind is that although we've reburied 13 remains, 13 individuals, there's still the others out there who are still unnamed, undocumented, unaccounted for. And so as the monument stands for those that we know, it also stands for what we still have yet to learn. And I think through our efforts, through all the efforts of the people here, that we are bringing that to returning it to our collective memories. And for that, I am truly grateful for all the work you do and for bringing it and keeping it at our conscious level. There is still more work to be done. Well, thank you so much. Thank you. Welcome back to our closing session for our program, Portsmouth Remembers. And I'm very grateful to all who came today to share their stories and to offer hope and a model for where we go from here. I would be really remiss if I didn't bring Valerie Cunningham back on stage. This has been her life work, from the woman who sat in the library poring over papers, just searching to find herself in the city in which she lived, a bit of history that she knew had to be there. And it's been a journey, and I am so grateful for all the people, all the women. We have two really strong women in this city, Vernice Jackson and Valerie Cunningham, who have worked to bring African American, Black history, African history and culture to life in this city. And for that, I'm truly grateful. And I thank you, Valerie, for bringing me on this journey along with you. And thank you so much. What happened on Chestnut Street is a great testament to the work of individuals. The individual and coming together in a collective to see centuries of errors corrected. And we hope that this journey doesn't end here. I want to read a passage, just a few words from poet and activist June Jordan, which I think is so appropriate for where we are in this moment, now, not back then, but right now. And it's, if you make and keep my life horrible, then when I tell the truth, it will be a horrible truth. It will not sound good or look good, or God's willing, feel good to you either. The story of African Americans in this country, the story of slavery and its aftermath, it's not a pretty story. It's a difficult story, it's a hard story to tell, and it's a hard story to listen to. But it's in the telling that we can heal. It's in the telling of the truth as it was that we can move forward. And I think we are at the beginning of that journey of telling the truth and moving forward. And with that, we're closing our program with a promise of what Portsmouth can be. Thank you for listening, and thank you for being here.